Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hi there, and welcome to Myth and Magic. So last week I didn't do a show, and there's a reason for that. I was in the depths of the county, or nay, the kingdom of Kent in the south of England. This is the land of the Canti. If you've been watching the superb Britannia TV series, you'll know about the Canti. I was staying in a mini castle. Yes, that's right, you heard me correctly. A mini castle, kind of on my own, shut away from the world, and I was writing a big chunk of my current 85k90 fantasy fiction project. Now, I'll put on the pictures of my one-man castle, and perhaps I'll tell you about it next week. But if you're eager to see the castle right now, then you better head to my Instagram account, and it's Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word, where I've already put on a couple of pictures that I took during my stay. Anyway, while I was down there in the little castle, I did a bit of exploring of the Canti region. I went to the ancient and very interesting town of Faversham, which still has a working brewery and was once known for its gunpowder works. In fact, they still do make explosives in the town. It's such a great place, a really good find, and I was overjoyed to discover that it was not only unspoiled, but it was also filled with lots and lots of very interesting local history. I also went out to Whitstable, which is the oyster capital of England. And this was another great place with an amazing history and a close association, I found out, with Peter Cushing, the Dracula actor who acted in many Hammer horror films. But also take the opportunity, because I was so close, to go out to the imposing twin towers of the medieval church of Reculver, Reculver, and this dominates the skyline of Herne Bay. Now, I chatted about Reculver in episode 5 when I talked about 4 darkly magical castles in England. The Reculver Towers are the last remaining structures of a settlement that dates back thousands of years, and it was built by the Romans on top of existing buildings that were probably used by Druids. So if you've been watching Britannia and you want to think about where the Roman headquarters were, it was probably here. Anyway, Stone Age flint tools had been found on this coastline, and Iron Age gold coins have also been found at the site, and these predate the Roman occupation of 43 AD. But we know that the Romans established a fortress here because they built it on existing earthworks, and they talked about those earthworks when they built it. And they had a very large military presence here as well. Now, the scary thing about Reculver, my goodness, it does look scary, especially in the half-light. And the reason that I included it in the 4 darkly magical castles of England, episode 5, is because there were at least 10 infant burials at this site. And what I mean by that is there were babies intentionally buried here under the foundations of the castle. It's thought that the babies were probably buried in the building as a ritual sacrifice, and locals still believe that the place is haunted, and they still say that you can hear the sounds of babies crying if you visit Reculver at night. By the 5th century, the Romans had long since abandoned Reculver as a fortress, and it had fallen into disrepair. And even so, much of the original structure still remained. In fact, some of the Roman stones are still there now. And so, in 669 AD, an Anglo-Saxon monastery was built on the site, and this used many of the existing Roman features. This monastery eventually became a parish church, and it was used as a local church for 300 years. But a decision was taken in 1805, so quite recently, to demolish much of the church and to use the stone to build a new church on the higher ground at Hillborough. Most of the building was taken away for this purpose, but the twin towers of Reculver were left in situ, and they're still used by ships even to this day as an aid for navigation. Reculver Towers. So we're continuing our work on our fantasy fiction project that we're working together on, and we've already covered theme for your fantasy fiction project, and you should have by now settled on a plot line because we've already looked at that, and we've also looked closely at how your hero, that's the main character in your plot, is developed, and also how to write a good antagonist. So I expect now you are wanting to write and you're itching to go. But I want you to hold your horses a little bit longer. Whoa! What about point of view? And from now on, I'm going to say P.O.V. P.O.V. Point of view. P.O.V. The first thing I want to say is that some people don't like first-person perspective stories. A reader that I know well told me that she would never read a book if it was written in first person. You know, these are the ones which have lines like, I went to seek the dragon, or I looked into the mouth of the cavern and I saw a terrible shape. Some people flatly refuse to read fiction if it's written in first person singular, and I know that's very prejudicious and a naughty way to behave, but that's just how it is. So although you might want to at some stage try a first person P.O.V. fiction project, and I have tried 2 so far, I would advise against a first-person P.O.V. for your first fantasy fiction project. So, let's agree on this one. Almost everyone absolutely detests third-person omniscient. Now, third-person omniscient storylines start with he or she, as if the narrator is talking about a character from a distance. But third-person omniscient goes a little bit further than that. It's as if this unseen narrator is following the character around using some kind of drone, together with some kind of listening device. Omniscient means godlike and all-knowing. And so you ask yourself, and you keep wondering, who is this invisible, godlike narrator? And why doesn't he or she come down and introduce themselves? Are they shy? And also, why is this invisible narrator trying to get into mine, i.e. the reader's head, and attempting to interpret my thoughts? And also, more importantly, trying to interpret the thoughts and actions of the hero. It's kind of irritating. These interpolations by the omniscient narrator become really annoying. I recently, only a couple of months ago, read a George Orwell novel that I'd never read before. And if you want to find out which novel it was, you should follow me on Goodreads. But in that, he has he goes off onto omniscient mode, and he comes up with lots and lots of debates that really had nothing to do with the book. And it was no wonder George Orwell himself didn't particularly like the book. This type of P.O.V., by the way, was ultra popular back in the golden days of literature, and the great writers of the 19th century you've almost always used it in their great novels, and that's probably why Tolkien uses it in The Lord of the Rings, and also why George Orwell used it. It's also why you've read this type of fiction so many times before, so it's familiar to you, because you were forced to read it at school. But the downside of this type of P.O.V., apart from the feeling that there's this god narrator who gets in the way of the hero, is that the reader can't do the magical things that we would love to do. The reader can't get inside a character. For example, not many of us are spies or space adventurers. Even less of us are dragon slayers or pirates. But with enriched P.O.V., we can actually be the hero, or the anti-hero if that's your bag. and we can actually experience what it's like to wield a sword, or drink some poison, or get stung by a poisoned arrow, or smell a fat troll's fart. Now, if you're a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, also known as A Game of Thrones to non-readers, and you like books such as, for example, Six of Crows or Gone Girl or The Lunar Chronicles, then you'll love the idea of multiple P.O.V. It means that in just one novel, a reader can experience what it's like to be a king, and then a dwarf, and then maybe an assassin, and then maybe a hunter after some dangerous prey. Me, being completely mad, I wrote my first ever novel as a multiple P.O.V. in multiple P.O.V. format. Certainly because I was influenced by George R.R. Martin, by the way. And I quickly found that there were rules that needed to be followed in multiple P.O.V. if you don't want everything to go madly wrong. And the rules are, as far as I could work out, this. Number one, each of your P.O.V. characters must have a well-defined and autonomous inner voice. Each P.O.V. character must have their own story arc. Number three, scenes involving multiple points of view can only be engaged through one P.O.V. So even if you have 2 points of view, you can only engage the scene using one of your P.O.V. characters. And finally, and this is probably the most difficult one, the author needs to fully engage with each of his or her P.O.V. characters. So if you go back to Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin likes the imp just as much as he might like Sansa, or he might like Jon Snow. He likes all of them, he loves all of them, and he fully engages with all of them. Each one has their own separate story arc. Each scene is engaged only through one P.O.V., and each of those characters has their own autonomous inner voice and is well defined. Now, I found that a common multiple P.O.V. error is what I would call the unauthorised mind flip. Unauthorised mind flip. This is when a character can inexplicably think or feel what a completely different character knows or feels. The simplest way to prevent this, and the way that George R.R. Martin keeps on top of it, is to contain each of your multiple P.O.V. stories inside their own chapter. So they're contained within that. So in other words, if each of your viewpoint characters has his or own chapter, then you can't get this unauthorised mind flip. Of course, one P.O.V. character may well meet another P.O.V. character, and that's of course when you can mistakenly do this mind flip. Now, of course, you might have already guessed this, but the multiple P.O.V. method is actually third-person point of view. And it's just like the hated third-person omniscient point of view that I talked about earlier. And that's because, let's be honest, it's hard to write a meaningful novel with meaningful multiple plot lines when it's in first person. Now, I know that because I've tried it. In one of my first person novels, it is written as a collection of statements, and each is collected by a detective in a crime case. And incidentally, that's why it takes about a week or longer to go through the entire testimony in a case in a court, because it's so hard to find the story pattern amongst all these individual first-person statements. Anyway, if you want to be rigorously academic about it, and hopefully you don't, but if you want to be rigorously academic about it, the multiple P.O.V. approach that I just talked about and that George Martin uses, and you might want to consider yourself, is actually third person limited. It's limited because only one character is closely followed in each chapter. Remember, that's how I told you that George is able to control his characters and stop the mind flips. And it's third person because he uses the pronouns such as they, he and she. So don't use first person because it's going to be hard to do a multiple plotline novel. Definitely don't use omniscient third person. Try not to use multiple third person limited, even though it's multiple P.O.V. I think what you want to do is limit your third person to about 2 or maybe 3 P.O.V. It differs from the horrible, unloved third-person omniscient, and I'm sorry about this, Tolkien, because the fictional world is experienced at ground level and skin deep. It's close up and it's very personal. So, for example, the reader can touch and smell the earth. It's not told by an unseen narrator who's floating above everybody in a drone, and this narrator is able to swoop down and inhabit the minds of any character at random, or worse, much worse, like George Orwell, he's ready to offer their own opinion about what's going on down there in the world that they created. Third person POV is about trying to get close to the action. Now, how to do this and how to imagine it and how to get your head around third person POV, multiple POV even, and certainly limited POV, is to imagine that you're a camera operator and you're working on a new feature film. So, the director has asked you to film the next scene on the shoulder. Do you know what that means? Have you ever seen footage like that? It's often used in action sequences to suggest urgency or atmosphere or imminent danger or some kind of confinement. Well, that's your job as a fantasy fiction writer using third-person limited POV. You'll be on the character's shoulder. So, therefore, you'll smell the monster's breath. You'll hear the cackle of the witch. You'll feel the heat of the fire. You'll even get to taste the fresh bread. And if it gets too much, if it gets too close, then you might want to step back a few feet just to get a wider angle, perhaps. Perhaps you want to take in all of the dragon's wing, or perhaps you'd like to see all of the treasure in the cave. So now and then you might step back a little, but never far. Can you imagine the film director, for example, telling you to step back slightly and take a picture of this huge horizon or this huge panoramic sheen with your little on-the-shoulder lens? No, I don't think he would. I mean, he might possibly say, for example, your character finds himself or herself on the edge of a mountain ledge or at the rim of a crater, perhaps on the moon. Then the director might say, do a little shot of how steep the fall is, or do a little shot of how sharp that rim is. But if he wants a big wide-angle shot, he's not going to use you. He's not going to use the on-the-shoulder lens, is he? So the on-the-shoulder lens, the limited POV, is all about getting up close and personal, in the face of the smells, in the dirt, in the heat, in the colours, in the action. I suppose the most important thing to remember if you're using this type of POV, and I strongly suggest that you do for your first fantasy fiction project, is that you can only report what your POV character experiences. And the reason for that is because you're on the shoulder of that character. So, here are the rules. Number 1, report what your POV character, not you, experiences and use all of your character's senses. Number 2, report what your POV character, not you, thinks. Number 3, report how your POV character, not you, interprets what is going on. Number 4, report what your POV character, not you, says in such circumstances. And report how your POV character, not you, deals with any crisis. Because you're just the on-the-shoulder guy. You can't determine or influence events. Sorry about that. And I'm sorry if it scares you, but that's how it is. If the POV character decides to fling themselves into a fiery volcano, then I'm sorry to say you're going to have to go with them, because you need to experience, remember, all of these sights and the smells and the dirt and the heat and the colour and eventually the pain that goes with jumping into a volcano. Yep, you're going to have to suffer the consequences for your art, but I strongly suggest that you use limited third-person POV for your project. Good luck with it. Tell me how you're getting on. The expansion of Rome. This week I want to concentrate on the expansion of Rome as we continue a study into classical Rome. In episode 19 we looked at how the Romans had begun, and who was there before them. And in episode 20, we looked at the pantheon of the Roman gods, and we talked about how myth and magic was part of their daily lives. But today I want to start to explore the Roman expansion of the known world. Now, before I do that, I want you to imagine the Mediterranean Sea. So don't get your atlas out just yet. No, I want you to imagine it as a fat river. Now, you might already know that because the Mediterranean, or I'm going to call it the Med from now on, because the Med is landlocked, it has no tides. So hopefully it's not hard to imagine the Med as a crocodile-shaped river, with its snout pointing towards the Atlantic and its right foreleg becoming the Adriatic Sea. And the Adriatic Sea is the channel that divides the region we now call Italy from the region we now call the Balkans. The crocodile's eye is Corsica, and his belly is the Gulf of Sidra around Libya. Now imagine that you live along this crocodile river's banks. It's fairly obvious that you'll treat this big fat crocodile-shaped river just like any other river, and you'll make it your main route, won't you? You'll sail your little boats up and down it to meet others, and perhaps you'll go a little bit further on some days and not so far on others. And because it's a rather swollen river, you might not dare go right across it, you'll just go along the edges. But if you do want to go on the other side of the river, then you'll soon learn that if you get all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar, it's only 14 miles across, so you can easily go across there and then come down the other side. And this is exactly how the ancient people of the Mediterranean saw the Med. They saw it as a big fat crocodile-shaped river, and they used it like a river. It's important to get that into your head to start with. Now, the Romans were in the area we now call Italy, and that's just above the crocodile's left eye. And once they'd subdued all of the other tribes on the Italian peninsula, including their Etruscan ancestors, then they wanted to begin to found their own colonies. So the first thing we need to do is to think about what a colony is. Well, normally a colony is founded by a mother city, and this is known as the metropolis. And a colony is a city-state that is bounded to its metropolis through legal, military and commercial ties. So, going back to the little boats that were bobbing along the crocodile-shaped river, imagine that one little boat came across a place that seemed deserted, and the captain of the little boat decided it might be a good place to set up shop. Well, they would set up shop. They'd stop their little boats and they'd establish a foothold. And once this foothold was established, they would, of course, have it resupplied from the mother city. And this resupplying would take some time. It would continue until the foothold could fend for itself. And that's exactly what happened along the sides, the banks, if you like, of the crocodile-shaped river, the Med. Now, because all the travelling in Bronze Age period was done by little boats, they didn't have big sailing ships, then these new colonies all tended to be along the coast, places where you could bring a little boat up onto the shore quite easily. And of course there were big tribes inland, and these caused some trouble later, and we'll go into that in a later show. But for the moment I want you to think about these little new colonies that were being seeded all along the banks of the Crocodile River Med. These little seeds were the coastal settlements of the Mediterranean. Now, Egypt, we know, had a colony during this period. It was in Canaan, Canaan, and it's probably the oldest colony that we know about. It was established in 3100 BC, so a very long time ago. But there were other colonies, and Rome, being by the sea, was keen to start exploring and forming some colonies of its own. However, they were a bit late to the game, and so by the time they joined in, most of the really good empty bits on the map had already been taken. So it seemed that they would need to use their ingenuity if they wanted to get bigger and become a power themselves. So talking about powers, the Phoenicians were the prize-winning top-grade merchant adventurers of the Med. Because of their feisty attitude and their enterprising journeying, they soon became a major trading power in the Mediterranean area. They had established many colonies around the Med, and one of their strategic aims right from the start was to control access to all the valuable sea trading routes. The Phoenicians were originally from the land of Lebanon, over in the Middle East, at a place near Tyre, Tyre. And so that's right over by the crocodile's tail parts, near his bumhole area. And Tyre, by the way, is the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Later, their most successful colony became independent from them. It was in North Africa and was known as Carthage. When I went there, I went to Tunisia and I visited Carthage, which they call Carthage. Now, as seafarers themselves, the Carthaginians, also known as the Punics, Punics, worshipped a weather god, which makes sense because they're a seafaring nation, and the weather god was named Baal, B-A-A-L, who himself is connected to the god Dagon, who was a merman and whose origin goes right back to at least 2500 BC. They also believed in a Hercules-type hero named Melkart. Carthage, as I said, managed to become independent of its mother city of Tyre, and it grew into a monster civilization of its own that threatened the very existence of Rome. And we'll come to that bit of the story a little later. But first, let's turn our attention to Greece. So Greece is on the upper back of the crocodile. Now, the first thing to understand about Greece, and it's something that is important to understand even now, is that Greece did not exist as one nation. Now, you might remember in episode 12 of Myth and Magic that I described how Britain was once several smaller kingdoms, so that the United Kingdom of Great Britain, that we now understand, was actually a joining up of lots of little independent kingdoms. And that's the same with Greece. Greece as a concept didn't ever really exist, and it doesn't really even exist now. The Hellenic Republic, which is what it is, and that's how they themselves describe modern Greece, is a loose confederation of many tribes and many realms and many kingdoms. And it didn't just start in the caves in the area we now call Macedonia. No, it started in and around an island group known as the Cyclades in the Aegean Sea in around 3200 BC, about the same time that the Phoenicians were starting to trade. It began as a loose group of late Stone Age and early Bronze Age peoples who used their little boats, just like I said before, to get from one of the islands to another. There are about 30 main islands in the group, and they soon found each other and then started creating new colonies all along the coasts of these little islands and all along the rivers. And this happened at about the same time that other tribes became established on the mainland of Greece, the Tridents. And this is also why Greece is only a concept and doesn't really exist even now, because the tribes on the bigger islands, the tribes on islands such as Crete and on Rhodes and on Cyprus and even on Sicily, and yes, before you write in and tell me that's Italian, I'll get to that in a minute, those tribes on those islands were separate civilizations as well. We now think of the whole thing as being Greece, but even now it's not really. So the ancient Greeks, if there was ever such a thing, had their colonies too. But it's hard to estimate how many Greek colonies there were, because the Greeks, as I've just said, were a united amalgamation of city-states that were scattered all around the Med, not just one realm as we understand a state to be these days. and many of these city-states had their own colonies. So, for example, we know that more than 30 Greek city-states had their own multiple colonies, and these could be found dotted around the crocodile map of the Mediterranean. The Greek city-states began establishing colonies of their own from between about 900 to 800 BC, and it wasn't long before these threatened the progress of Rome as well. So Rome was now threatened by the Carthaginians, who were over in Africa, on the neck of the crocodile, and the Greeks, to the right of Rome, up by the scruff of the crocodile's neck. After the conquests by Alexander the Great in 323 BC, the Greeks established colonies as far away as India and Central Africa, as well as all across Europe, but we'll turn to that a little bit later. But because first I want to talk about Roman Sicily. Now, the Romans were initially interested in expansion via the island of Sicily. Now, if you remember from the first show I did about the Romans, Italy looks like a boot. It looks like the kind of boot that would belong to a steampunk lady. Anyway, Rome is right up the leathery thigh area of the steampunk boot, and so that's a long way away from the island, because the island at the bottom is the chunk of stuff which is being kicked by the toe of the boot into the water. So when the Romans looked at Sicily with their greedy eyes, they knew it lay under Carthaginian control. Now, the Carthaginians, if you remember, were the African people who'd gained independence from their mother city of Tyre. And Rome might have been an evolving power, but it lacked, at this stage, a full navy. It wasn't a sea power at this point. But it did have one ginormous trick up its sleeve. It had the first ever fully professional army. Yes, that's right. The Roman army was not just a band of ploughboys and blacksmiths who got together at the weekends to play at soldiering. They were a regular army. Fully paid, fully trained. They were real warriors. Anyway, the administration in Rome decided that the control of Sicily would be the first necessary step in developing a naval strategy that would launch them into the Med. And from the island of Sicily, they could easily reach out towards Carthage, which is in the south. They could reach out to Sardinia in the west, or Sparta in the east. They could even reach Crete in the southeast. Crete is the cradle of the Minoan civilization, and that's down by the crocodile's kind of sort of like shoulder blades. Anyway, after a political betrayal on the island of Sicily, the intensifying tensions between the two powers escalated into full-blown war between Carthage and Rome. And after a land battle at Agrigentum in 262 BC, the Carthaginian leadership found that the professional Roman legions were more powerful than them on land. But in 260 BC, they defeated a fledgling Roman army at the Battle of the Lipari Islands, a sea battle. Rome responded to this defeat by expanding its navy. This was a key moment in the history of Rome. In just 2 months, the Romans had constructed a fleet of over 100 warships. They also invented something that they called the Corvus, C-O-R-V-U-S, which is an assault bridge that was attached to the prow of a warship and was used as a boarding device. The sharply pointed beak of the device, which is why it's called a corvus, by the way, because corvus means raven or crow, would dig into an enemy's decking when the contrivance was lowered. And then a disciplined party of professional Roman soldiers would march across the bridge and board and overwhelm the less trained, more lightly armed seafarers that they found on the other side. It was a recipe for victory, and of course the Carthaginian navy was defeated. As the Roman navy became more experienced and proficient, they relied on their corvus less, and eventually they phased it out. But the invention certainly gave them an advantage over the Carthaginian navy, and they soon gained naval superiority over the Carthaginians. And so in 241 BC, Carthage signed a peace treaty with Rome, and under the terms they evacuated Sicily and they paid Rome a huge fine. After this date, several trade agreements were signed between Rome and Carthage, and they even struck up a shaky but mutual alliance. So during this time of shaky peace, Rome did exactly what it set out to do, and it annexed the Crocodile's Eye, and that's the island of Corsica, and with it the larger island of Sardinia. And originally these two islands were Carthaginian colonies. Now this angered the Carthaginian leadership so much that they demanded sanctions. However, there was little that they could do about it, especially because they were involved at that stage in a very bitter civil war of their own. But in 219 BC, the famous General Hannibal, attacked a town in eastern Spain, near the modern port of Valencia, by the way. And this was a colony that had been given special protection by Rome. This was a very provocative move by General Hannibal, and it was thought to have been politically inspired. But anyway, as a direct result of this insult, Rome demanded that Hannibal should be handed over to them for punishment. But the Carthaginian leadership refused and said it was a response anyway to their illegal annexation of Sardinia and Corsica. So, because they had been insulted, Rome declared war on Carthage. This led to what was known as the Second Punic War, 218-201 BC, and is best remembered because we've all heard the story. Hannibal crossed the Alps with war elephants. Hannibal's army invaded the country we now call Italy from the north, which was totally unexpected. And they defeated a surprise Roman army in several battles along that frontier. And whilst fighting Hannibal's army in Italy, Spain and in Sicily, Rome was also simultaneously fighting against a now quite dangerous Macedonian army in the First Macedonian War. And yes, that's because the ancient Greeks had popped up out of nowhere and used the moment to take advantage of what they thought was a weakened Rome to start their own activities. Now, Hannibal might have defeated the Roman legions in several engagements, but because he never received the urgent reinforcements that he requested continually from his home city of Carthage, he found he had to forage for supplies and he had to use vital military assets to protect his supply chains. This made him weaker. On the other side of the coin, the Romans were unable to gain any notable victory over him, and this was even with a standing professional army, so instead they harried his troops and they attacked Hannibal's supply lines. This went on for 16 years, until the Romans took the initiative and cut off Hannibal's sea supply routes at their actual origins, because they started to blockade the African ports and they started to impose sanctions on anyone who they thought was helping the Carthaginians. A land battle at Zama, in present-day Tunisia, led by General Scipio the Great, concluded the Second Punic War. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, involved an extended siege of Carthage, the place I went to visit near Tunis, and ended in the city's complete destruction. And once Rome had emerged victorious from the three Punic Wars with the Carthaginians, they inhabited and controlled the existing Carthaginian colonies, and therefore they controlled access to all the most valuable sea trading routes of the Med. Before we finish, let's just quickly turn to Rome v Greece. So to us, Athens is Greece. Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, the physician Hippocrates, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle all came from Greece, the Greece that we think of as Greece, the Athens Greece. But prior to the rise of Athens, Sparta considered itself to be the lead city of the Greeks. And this was a fact that was bitterly fought over for many years. But after the war with Persia, they formed what was to become an Athenian-dominated alliance, although in the 4th century BC, the North Greek city-state and the colonies of Macedon had become the dominant Greek region. The amazing conquests by Alexander the Great of Macedonia widened the Greek horizons beyond their wildest dreams and made the traditional Greek city-states obsolete because it created one Alexandrian Greek empire, and the Alexandrian Greek empire had a nucleus in Athens, and so that's why we tend to think of Greece as an Athenian Greece. We'll discuss how the Romans utilised the Greeks, or was it the other way round, in the next show.